Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your boy Preston here, and this is my quick preview and prediction for Oscar Collazo versus Jesus Haro. And overall, this fight is going to be a strawweight fight, or not a strawweight fight. This is going to be a minimum weight fight. So this is like the lowest weight class in boxing, and shit like that, is minimum weight, if I'm not mistaken, and shit like that. Like this is like the lowest weight class in boxing, like let me go look. Well, actually, this fight is actually is actually a strawweight fight and shit like that, but it's also called minimum weight, strawweight. I mean, because ESPN and stuff like that, you know what I mean, pronounced it as minimum weight, and shit like that. But it's called minimum. Oh yeah. But it's minimum weight, straw weight, and shit like that. You know what I mean? I don't know. Like, does it say a super straw weight or whatever it is? And shit like that. You know what I mean? But 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 yeah, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But Collazo is the right now the 105 straw weight WBO and like probably the WBO like interim WBO and probably like the regular WBO champion, because he has two WBO belts. Oscar Collazo has, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And he's been protecting those belts for a long time, bro. And he's been fighting good fighters, and he's been doing his thing, bro, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? But yeah, man, and that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? But on to these fighters' record. All right, so we're gonna start off with the champ of Oscar Collazo, and Oscar Collazo has a perfect record of 13 wins, 0 losses, 10 wins coming by way of knockout. And he is a 5-star on BoxRec. And just like I said and stuff like that, you know what I mean? You see how BoxRec says minimum weight? That's just like another abbreviation for straw weight. Because I looked it up on boxing rankings and stuff, and they don't have any listed of minimum weight, and shit like that. So so minimum weight is just straw weight, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But it just boxing likes to analyze it, in different terms and stuff, which I like, how they do that and stuff like that. You know what I mean? But this dude has been in 78 rounds of boxing, bro, and only 13 fucking bouts, bro. That's impressive. That's impressive, bro. That's already impressive by itself, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But yeah, man, look at all these fucking wins: knockout, TKO, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And he's beat some names. I ain't finna lie. I mean, he did beat some names. And look at this Melvin Jerusalem. This is one of his biggest wins, was Melvin Jerusalem, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Because I actually remember watching this fight, actually, and shit like that. You know what I mean? Because I actually remember watching that fight when he fought against Jerusalem. Hold on, let's see if I could get these ads out of your guys' way, because I know it's really, really annoying how these ads are just randomly in the way, blocking everything. But yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But Melvin Jerusalem, like, and he's been winning, bro. Unanimous decision, beat this Luis Castillo dude. I don't know about Luis Castillo, but I mean, got Castillo in his name, and shit like that, gave him his first loss, and shit like that, so, and knowing with Melvin Jerusalem is a good fighter. I've seen him fight. He actually is a pretty good fighter, in my opinion, and stuff like that, definitely had, like, and he's been a champion numerous of times, and shit like that, you know what I mean? I mean, he's easily championship worthy and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, like, he's a great fighter, he's a great fighter, Melvin Jerusalem, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, But that's definitely one of Oscar Collazo's best wins for sure, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And then after that, let me see. Oh, he beat this boy Themanoon Naim Strong. I think I heard of him before. And I think he fights preferably out of out of is that, what is that, Thailand? Where is he from? Thailand. Yeah, Thailand. Yep. He is originally from Thailand. Surin, Thailand. And stuff like that. So he fights out of Thailand, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And he's fighting this one dude, Shikiti Iwata. Either way, I'm just saying, this dude has some good wins, bro. He has some good fucking wins. You know what I mean? Like, he has some good wins, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. He got some good wins and stuff like that, and he gave this Demanun Niem Strong dude his first loss of his career. And I believe I see, and if I'm not mistaken, I believe I remember me seeing that fight. I remember him. I've seen so many fights of Oscar Collazo. I've seen the fight with him in Melbourne, Jerusalem, and I had to see that fight when he fought against Demanun Niem Strong, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And he got stopped in the 7th round. So I ain't gonna lie, boy. That boy Oscar Collazo is moving, bro. And shit like that. You know what I mean? And I'm just saying, and shit like that. Like, am I recording? Let me see. There we go. But yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So, damn, bro, and shit like that, so he got a good record, man, and shit like that. Jesus Haro. Haro has a record of 13 wins, 3 losses, 2 wins coming by way of knockout. Oh, you know what I mean? And that's the thing. So Jesus Haro has a record of 13 wins, 3 losses, 2 wins coming by way of knockout. And shit like that. You know what I mean? But the one thing though, even though his record is kind of ugly looking, he is better than what he does look like. And shit like that, like on his record, because I feel like not a lot of people have really had much footage of him. I had only a little bit of footage of him, and only a little bit of footage when he fought against this one dude who, sorry about that. I don't know why that's on my screen. Can I fucking, hold on, guys. But yeah, man, and shit like that. But I only really seen that fight when he fought against this Lito Dante dude. But honestly, in that fight, I mean, it showed enough in that fight. And he does know how to box, man. He does know how to box. He can hit you. He can pop you. Make you realize things and shit like that. He can honestly get strict success and stuff like that. And he has enough technique to do that. I mean, it doesn't mean you have 2 knockouts. Doesn't mean you can't, back somebody up and outbox somebody with extreme power. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, So I feel like when it comes down to Jesus Haro, I can't understand why they're putting Oscar Collazo against Jesus Haro, because Jesus Haro is more of kind of like a versatile challenge, and shit like that, more of for Jesus because Jesus Haro is more of like a versatile challenge for Oscar Collazo, and he's a Mexican fighter. You know what I mean? You know how Golden Boy is, and they wanted to promote their Mexican fighters and shit like that, and make it like, I'm just saying, which is nothing wrong with it, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. You know what I mean? But yeah, and shit like that. But Haro definitely knows how to box and shit like that. Definitely knows how to use range and shit like that. Definitely has a really good jab. And shit like that. Quick, quick jab. You got a butter of a jab, man. You got a good jab, Jesus Haro. And shit like that. And that's the thing and shit. So I can understand why they're having this dude go against him, but it just there hasn't really been much wins he has had. Only one 12-round fight, what I mean? But he's had 1, 2. He's had 1 and 2 10-round fights, and this will be his second 12 round. So I mean, he's starting to get started with his rounds, and yeah. But yeah, man, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But overall and shit like that, when it comes down to in this fight and shit like that, you know what I mean? overall, and shit like that, what these fighters need to do to winning this fight. I'm just gonna say both these fighters just need to do what they need to do and shit like that, fight how they do and stuff like that. Collazo just needs to understand that this is gonna be more a versatile fight. He might have to realize it when he gets in there, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Or he did get some footage on Jesus Haro, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, but it just he has to just be prepared that that he is a tricky fighter. He knows how to slip punches. He knows how to keep the fight at range, not take a whole lot of damage. But at the same time and shit like that, you know what I mean? He could still take advantage of that, and shit like that, by, putting the pressure on, cutting the distance, using lateral movement, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Moving his head and of course, throwing his power shots, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And combinations with his power and all that, and stuff like that, what Jesus Haro needs to do to win this fight is like how he's like how he's boxed, against what's his name? Hold up. But basically, like the way of how he fought this dude named Lito Dante, Jesus Haro, you know what I mean? Fight how you did in that fight, you know what I mean? Because you boxed beautifully in that fight. And I feel like, honestly, as long as you train and as long as you are in the right training mindset, you can be able to utilize distance and could potentially outbox Oscar Collazo and end up pulling the extreme upset in this fight, and shit like that, you know what I mean? He has all the willpower to doing that, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, But next is who I think is gonna win this fight and shit like that, you know what I mean? Round for round and shit like that, you know what? Hold on, let me be right back. But yeah, and stuff like that, you know what I mean? But overall, and stuff like that, who I think is gonna win this fight and shit like that, you know what I mean? I think the early rounds and stuff like that, honestly, I feel like the early rounds and stuff like that, you know what I mean? Um, you know, I I would say that that at the end of the day, Collazo would be winning the early rounds, but it would be kind of competitive and shit like that. I'll probably give a round to Luis Haro and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. And I'll give 3 rounds to Collazo. So I'm gonna say it's gonna be 3 rounds to 1 for Collazo in the early rounds, mid rounds and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Um, Honestly, I think it's gonna be more similar, but I feel like Jesus Haro is starting to, realize what he needs to do and keeping, the distance, and he's starting to find a little bit more success, and shit like that, in the mid rounds. Still 3 rounds to 1 in favor of of uh of Oscar Collazo, and shit like that, mainly because of just punch output, and shit, hurt Jesus Haro a few times. But then in the later rounds and shit like that, you know what I mean? That's where I see where Collazo is gonna be really starting to put on the pressure. Is gonna be really gonna be hitting Jesus Haro and shit like that, But honestly, from the movement of what I've seen from Jesus Haro, but I just don't think he's gonna be able to run away like that, and just be able to, because it's an art to avoid punches like that, bro. And I don't know how he's gonna be able to avoid every single punch like that, and shit like that. But even though he did prove that he can move his feet around and shit like that, so I do think he'll get him more in the later rounds. But at the same time and shit like that, you know what I mean? I feel like that, Oscar Collazo is gonna hit, Jesus Haro, like a quick, strong body shot to the solar plexus, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And it just blows the gas tank out on Jesus Haro, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I mean? Basically hits him like right on the side of his body, just like it just like hits him right, right on the side on the side of his stomach, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like I believe that's what the solar plex is, right? Yeah, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But yeah, man, and shit like that, you know what I mean? But either way, I see Collazo ending the fight with the body shot, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. I see him ending the fight with the body shot, and stuff like that, against Jesus Haro, and shit like that. Even though Haro is gonna be fighting hard, I do think he will make Collazo have to work for his money and shit like that, you know what I mean? And stuff like that, but I feel like once Collazo really like can actually get into the range of Jesus Haro, that's when he's gonna get the stoppage, and shit, or get the stoppage or get the knockout, because I don't think Haro is gonna get up from that body shot. I think he's gonna be just rolling on the canvas in excruciating pain from that body shot, and shit like that, knowing that the smaller fighters can't really take body shots as well as like lightweights or lightweights in welterweights, super welterweights, like basically like the heavier divisions, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Like, straw weights, flyweights, they cannot take body shots that well. Like bantamweights, and shit like that, cannot take body shots that well. But especially not straw weights, and shit like that. So I think he's gonna catch him really good to the fucking body, blow his gas tank out. Cause I mean, they're only 105 pounds, bro. You know what I mean? So it just like the pain when it comes down to getting hit to the body is just like, it's different. I know how it is, because I'm still pretty skinny, but I just at the same time, I used to been kind of, but now I'm just a lot more lean and shit, but back in the day and shit, I used to been pretty fucking small, and I know what a body shot, what a hard body shot feels like, and shit like that, being that skinny, and it does not feel that well. A body shot in general doesn't feel that well, but when you're more like, if you got, but I mean, at the same time, when you got core, you can last with it longer, but you can still slip that punch in and just bam, and really blow your shit up, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. So either way, that's my final prediction for this fight. I got Oscar Collazo winning this fight by, I would say it's going to be a 8th round knockout to the solar plex, and shit like that, you know what I mean? Or not the solar plex, I mean like the ribs or some shit, or like basically on the side of the body and shit like that. He's gonna hit him like right to the side of the body and shit like that, you know what I mean? And it's gonna, and like either way, you can hit him right in the solar plex and right directly on the stomach. But I feel like, honestly, he could, because one thing with Oscar Collazo, he got some long arms and he could tag him like real quickly to the middle of the body. But I think it's gonna be a flurry, and then he just smacks him right to his ribs and shit like that. You know what I mean? He obliterates his ribs, and shit like that. You know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that. And stops and knocks him out in the 9th round. So that's my final prediction. I got Oscar Collazo knocking out Jesus Haro in the 8th round with a body shot to the ribs. And yeah, thank y'all for watching this video. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'm Preston. Peace out, man.